Hey everyone, so let's continue our discussion on motherhood by discussing the article on surrogacy. So, as you know from the reading, when we talk about surrogacy, what we're referencing here is when one female gestates the fetus for some other set of intended parent or parents. And within surrogacy, we want to differentiate between some different types. So the first differentiation I want us to make sure we're clear on is the distinction between partial surrogacy and gestational surrogacy. The reason I want to be really clear on this is because it can be a little counterintuitive, right? Partial surrogacy is when a surrogate is partially related to the fetus. So this means that the surrogate has contributed some genetic material. Typically, the egg is the fetus. The egg that has produced the fetus belongs to the surrogate, and so either the intended father has provided the genetic material in the form of sperm, or some third party donor has provided sperm to produce the ultimate fetus. Gestational surrogates, on the other hand, are contributing no genetic material and are providing a womb for gestating and not contributing any sort of mitochondria or an egg or any form of genetic material whatsoever. We're not in this course going to get into what has recently started to develop, which are sort of a misnomer three-parent or two-mother parents that have been discussed in the news recently, in which you have a woman whose egg is used, but a distinctive female whose mitochondria are used, where the first female's egg has mitochondria that might prove to be problematic. We won't get into that situation. That's not exactly surrogacy. That's a different matter and is unrelated to this topic. That said, we're going to stick with surrogacy and focus on partial surrogacy versus gestational. And then commercial versus altruistic, where commercial surrogacy is when a woman is paid a fee or a salary for performing the labor, the reproductive labor of gestating a fetus, where altruistic surrogacy is when a woman is unpaid. Now, altruistic surrogacy does not mean that the woman is not provided funding for, say, her medical expenses, or she might be provided with, say, a place to live. If the intended parents might want to have, say, a say in where she stays or that sort of a situation. In some jurisdictions, that might still fall under altruistic. That's where it can get a little bit legally fuzzy. But altruistic in general means that she is unpaid for that labor. So what are some of the moral issues that have left feminists on differing sides of the fence on what kind of legislation and even more generally how we should feel about surrogacy? Well, one of the first and foremost issues is the potential for exploitation. This has been largely framed in terms of the potential for exploitation of the surrogates. So who will be a surrogate? Are these going to be predominantly women who have few alternative options, so often framed in ways that are similar to arguments against prostitution, arguments against even pornography, for example, that these are examples of exploiting women's bodies and objectification of women's bodies. But there's also here the exploitation of surrogates insofar as, are these going to be women who have fewer alternative resources, and therefore, in addition to objectifying the female body itself, are we in particular going to be objectifying and exploiting poor women or women of color, women of third world countries? Lots of room for exploitation there. What's been less well discussed in the literature is often the exploitation of intended parents. So, the ways in which intended parents are exploited, sometimes by surrogates, but equally often, if not more often, by intervening services. So, those who serve as mitigation between a surrogate and an intended parent, who are facilitating that interaction. The way in which those who are desperate for children might be taken advantage of by those who are providing that service. Another important moral issue that we should consider is whether or not providing surrogacy, especially commercial surrogacy, suddenly turns individuals, persons, into commodities. If I pay someone to gestate a baby for me, if I decide for my career, for example, that I don't want to have my own baby, that I need that time for me, but I still want to have a child, and I pay someone else to do it, am I then buying a baby? Is that purchasing a person? And in that sense, am I then commodifying a human being? So we want to be very cautious with, is surrogacy baby selling, baby buying? Not arguing that it is, but this is one of the moral issues that has come up that we have to consider when we think about surrogacy. Is it buying the baby? Are you purchasing the person? Are you renting the womb? Are you paying the woman for her labor? Are you paying the woman for her time, for the hazards to her body? Those sorts of things. If we're paying a woman for her womb rental, is this commodification of her body? Is it commodification of herself? And is that commodification of herself exploitative, or is this an opportunity for her? When I commodify my time, I'm commodifying myself right now by virtue of putting myself on the internet for you to watch on your own time. But had I wanted to, I could have attached an ad to this video and commoditized this video where you would have had to watch an ad for, I don't know, shampoo or something. And then that would have commoditized this video itself and would have also exploited you and exploited me a little bit. Would allowing surrogacy, permitting surrogacy that is commoditized, that's commercialized, is that kind of commodification problematic and exploitative? Or is it more exploitative to require that it only be altruistic, in which case women feel compelled to do it based on our roles as nurturers and inherent caregivers and our socialized roles as mothers, women, those sorts of things. And I'd say we, speaking as a woman identified female. Then the social burdens of motherhood, is that more exploitative? That if my sister were to come to me and ask me to carry her fetus for her because she's unable to, and we live in a state where she cannot pay me, would the obligations to her as a sister make it so that I would be exploited by my family to do this really arduous task of labor and be exploited? These are all moral issues that we have to think about that, while the reading doesn't touch on, hopefully it will make us think a little more deeply and is something for you all to consider in your blogs. What exactly is motherhood? Is it something that we want to do, that we're compelled to do? Is it something that is socially impelled on us or that we're compelled to do? Things to think about. when it comes to this idea of legislating, which is something that surrogacy is, we should think about why we need to legislate it. So ART, artificial reproductive technologies, are something that is governed by the state. And state, I mean countries, as well as states. So there are laws governing artificial reproductive technologies at the national level in the United States, but also at the state level in, for example, Louisiana, where I am now. And artificial reproductive technology in general produces a lot of legal questions. There are legal questions such as who is the parental unit for the resulting child? So who has primary parental rights over the resulting child? Does it belong to whomever gestates the child? Does it belong to whomever owns the rights to the genetic material? And is that the persons who paid for those genetic materials? Or is that the persons who produced those genetic materials? Those are important questions. So rights of donors versus rights of purchasers versus rights of surrogates versus rights of intended parents. There's also some important questions as to the rights and obligations of physicians who perform artificial reproductive technologies. So what are the obligations of the physicians in terms of informed consent? But also, what are the obligations in terms of things like donor selection, availability of the treatment, and liability when maybe things don't go as planned? So what are some of the existing policies that are out there that shape the climate for those who are seeking surrogacy now? Well, in some places there's just no policy. So this could mean that professional organizations are allowed to self-regulate. Some countries, like Japan, for instance, it's not a real policy in place, but that's because their professional organizations have very strong recommendations for those who want to maintain licensure. In other places, there are what's called unenforceable contracts. So you could enter into a contract with a surrogate. I could enter into a contract with one of you to gestate my child, and we could write it all up and sign everything, and then at the last minute I could decide, I changed my mind, I don't want that baby, sorry. And if it's an unenforceable contract, now you have a baby, and it's yours, and congratulations, and I can give you a balloon and say thank you and have a great life. And that would be the end, and that's an unenforceable contract. On the same hand, I could give you all kinds of money and be expecting that baby and show up the day that you give birth, and you could say, oh, he's beautiful, I think I'm going to keep him. And if it's an unenforceable contract, even if I've given you thousands of dollars, you still get to keep him because it's an unenforceable contract. Another policy that exists is where states have what's called altruistic surrogacy only, which means you can have a contract that lays out a situation in which you and I agree that you're going to gestate my baby, and I'm going to have the baby after so long after the hospital, whatever terms we agree to, but it's only on the condition that I do not pay you. That probably doesn't sound awesome to you, those of you that are females. Those of you that are males are probably thoroughly confused as to how this surrogacy arrangement is going to work, period. In that situation, you're probably just my donor, and we'll have yet another surrogate. Whole different contract. There are still other situations in which there's a whole complicated web of who can enter into the surrogacy contract itself. A great example of this is Israel, which you read about in the article, where there are religious constraints, parameters on who can enter into the surrogacy contract with each other based on other sets of rules, in this case, largely religious ones. And then last but not least, there are states that allow commercial surrogacy. Some restrictions may apply. That's like the fine print you see scrolling at the end of any infomercial. With all of that said, I want to get to the really juicy part of why I wanted you to read about surrogacy in general in this big class that's about women's studies in general. Surrogacy is an interesting topic to cover because it begs some big important questions. Who is a mother? How do we define motherhood? Is a mother a person who goes through labor and physically has a baby? Or is a mother the person who wants to have a baby? Or is a mother a person who provides the egg or the gametes or the mitochondria that allow a baby to exist? Maybe as we enter into an increasingly litigious society and one that's further complicated with infertility crises and parental rights questions, we start to come up to, when those come into conflict, what is primary? The genetic parent? The parent who's provided the care? Or the person who intended to parent? So imagine you have a gestational surrogacy arrangement in which a woman who is unable to have children and is unable to contribute genetic material has found donor egg and has had it implanted in a different woman as a surrogate. So there is one woman, we'll name her Jamaica. Jamaica has donated an egg to Sarah, who is trying to have a baby, who is having that baby gestated by Ilana. Ilana, the surrogate, decides that she's in love with this baby when it's born. And she's really provided all the care. I mean, she's gestated it for 9 months. So when the baby's born, in terms of who's demonstrated care, Ilana's demonstrated care. But Sarah is the one who had the intent to have the baby, right? She's our intentional parent. So in terms of intent to be a mother, she demonstrated all the intent. She also wants the baby. But she's not the genetic mother. And our genetic mother, Jamaica, she also wants the baby. The baby looks just like her. I mean, exactly like her. So who should be the mother of this baby? It's an important question. This gets into, what is the role of the state in defining parenthood? Should the state have a role in defining parenthood? Well, in that situation with Sarah, Jamaica, and Ilana, the state has to intervene somehow, or would seem to have to. So what does the state do? And as alluded to in what you read, we also have an important question that arises with, how do the identities of parent, child, and citizen interact, especially when we cross international boundaries? So things for you to think about. Start writing in those blogs, and I'll look forward to reading those blogs.